Put your food down. This is going to be one of those videos that you'll need a strong stomach for. Today on History Calling, I tell you all about the miserable, painful and horribly smelly death of King John in 1216. You'll also hear about his burial and what was found when his grave was opened up not once but twice in the centuries following, including a detailed description of the body right down to the maggots eating him up, a drawing of his remains, and details of what grave goods and even bits of the king's skeleton were stolen by grave-robbing souvenir hunters. King John of England was born in 1166 or 1167, the youngest child of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Having taken the throne in 1199 after the death of his older brother Richard the Lionheart, and at the expense of his nephew Arthur of Brittany, whose deceased father had been another of John's brothers, he ruled until 1216, causing chaos and strife along the way. By the time of his death, he was widely suspected of killing Arthur in 1203. He had dumped his first wife to marry a much younger model in the form of Isabella of Angoulême, and he had mistreated and enraged his barons so much that they had revolted against him and made him sign Magna Carta in 1215 to protect their rights against his tyranny. Furthermore, the Pope had excommunicated him, and his throne had been offered to a French prince, Louis, who was married to John's niece, and who invaded England in May 1216, was proclaimed king there, though never crowned, and who managed to seize control of much of the country, including London. By the autumn of 1216, John was therefore in a right mess, and this is where we pick up his story. It was October of that year, and the king had been marching around the country with his army, trying to shore up his position and defend his crown against Louis. On the night of the 9th into the 10th of that month, he was in the town of Lynn, also known as King's Lynn, when he suffered an attack of dysentery. What exactly is dysentery, I hear you say? Well, it's an infection in your bowels which causes diarrhoea with blood in it. Nowadays it can be treated, but in the 13th century it could and did kill, as John discovered. In fact, his final days were miserable. We have several accounts of how he exited the mortal coil. The monk and chronicler Ralph of Coggeshall was based at the Abbey of Coggeshall in Essex, where he was the abbot between 1207 and 1218. He ultimately died in 1227. Thus, he was an adult living in England at the time of John's death, and a man of some importance who was based in a monastery with access to a correspondence network who could tell him details of John's demise, and who wrote his Chronicon Anglicanum within barely a decade at most of the king's death. He is therefore a useful source for John's final days, and he tells us that having arrived at Lynn, there, as it is said, because of excessive greed, since his, John's, stomach was always insatiable, having gorged himself to the point of drunkenness, he was afflicted with dysentery as a result of indigestion. Afterwards, when the flux had somewhat subsided, he was bled at a village called Lindesey, which is called Laxford. I had to use an online translator to get this text for you, so I'm not sure where this town is, as the names may not have translated properly. Then, when messengers from the besieged castle of Dover came to him and announced the reason for their coming, his illness, brought on by the pain he conceived, grew worse again. Moreover, a very great grief seized him, because he had lost on that journey his chapel with its relics, and also some of his baggage with various equipment in the well stream, and many of his household were drowned in the waters of the sea, and there swallowed up in the living sands, because they had entered incautiously and hastily while the tide of the sea had not yet receded. His illness, however, worsening over a few days, he died, having made his confession at the castle of Newark on the feast of St. Luke the Evangelist. Ralph gives us some great details here. John moved from the town of Lynn to Laxford, but on the way he lost much of his baggage train and household in the waters of the Wash. Now, exactly where this spot is contested, but historians think John was probably on the River Nen, which empties into the shallow bay known as the Wash. This famous incident is also credited with causing the loss of many of the English crown jewels in existence at that time, though what was truly lost is also contested, and we'll hear more about it in a minute from other sources. Beaten down by this loss and his illness in general, he then died at Newark on the night of the 18th into the 19th of October. Another account is that provided by Roger of Wendover, also an English monk and chronicler, and this time based largely at St Albans. Writing his book, The Flowers of History, in the 1220s or early to mid-1230s, he based his work largely on materials already available at the Abbey, but he was alive in 1216 and old enough to remember events of that year himself, and that gives him an extra point when it comes to credibility. He is known to have exaggerated for effect, though, and even just made details up on occasion, so despite the fact that he is a well-connected, contemporary English source, it is still worth taking his claims with a pinch of salt sometimes. He says that John, with a large force, had been committing terrible ravages in the counties of Suffolk and Norfolk. At last he took his way through the town of Lynn, where he was received with joy by the inhabitants and received large presents from them. He then took his march towards the north, but in crossing the river Welster, he lost all his carts, wagons, and baggage horses, together with his money, costly vessels, and everything which he had a particular regard for the land opened in the middle of the water and caused whirlpools which sucked in everything, as well as men and horses, so that no one escaped to tell the king of the misfortune. He himself narrowly escaped with his army, and passed the following night at a convent called Swine's Head, where, as was thought, he felt such anguish of mind about his property, which was swallowed up by the waters, that he was seized with a violent fever and became ill. His sickness was increased by his pernicious gluttony, for that night he surfeited himself with peaches and drinking new cider, which greatly increased and aggravated the fever in him. He, however, left that place at early dawn, although in pain, and proceeded to the castle of Lafort to take up his quarters. And at this place he was in such pain that on the following day it was with difficulty that he reached Newark on horseback. There his disease gained ground, and he confessed himself and received the Eucharist from the abbot of Croxton. Afterwards he appointed his eldest son Henry his heir, and made his kingdom swear allegiance to him. He also sent letters under his own seal to all the sheriffs and castellans of the kingdom, ordering them one and all to obey his said son. Being then asked by the abbot of Croxton where he would wish to be buried in case he should die, he answered, "To God and St. Wulstan I commend my body and soul." After this, on the night next after St. Luke the Evangelist's day, he departed this life. When the king was drawing near his death at Newark, messengers came to him there with letters from about 40 of the barons who wished to make their peace with him again, but as he was at the point of death, he could not give his attention to them. Roger gives us some extra details about John's travels in the days before his death, and how difficult it was for him to ride in his increasingly weakened condition. We need to imagine that he was having to stop to relieve himself more often than usual and was losing blood every time he did so, and possibly in between bowel movements as well. It must have been a horrific, not to mention very stinky, way to go. Like Ralph, though, Roger sees the death as a product of John's own greed, worsened by the emotional toll that the loss of his goods took on him. Another account comes from Matthew Paris, also a monastic chronicler. Now, he was born in about 1200, became a monk in 1217, the year after John's death, and was based out of St Albans too. With access to Roger of Wendover, he more or less just copied his forebearer when he wrote his own Chronica Majora and later his Historia Anglorum, so I'm not going to read out his entire account of John's death, as it would only repeat what you've just heard. He does, however, offer some extra details in the Historia Anglorum. Before I reveal what he said, please remember to hype, like and comment on the video and share it with a friend. If you'd like to get more from me, you can also become a YouTube member by clicking the join button under videos to get members-only posts and badges next to your name in the comments. Or head on over to patreon.com/historycalling, where I release even more bonus content every week, including extra podcasts and early access to ad-free videos. For those of you with Irish ancestry, there's also my book, Find Your Irish Ancestors Online, available from Amazon as an ebook and paperback and linked below. While you can get free bonuses if you join my mailing list on my website, historycallingofficial.com, after which you'll receive my newsletter plus 2 complimentary downloads right away about spotting good history books and interviewing your family members about your family tree. Please do remember to check that the newsletter isn't going to your junk mail though, and if it is, you'll need to designate it as not spam in your email account and possibly add the email address to your contacts list so that you don't miss out on future editions. Lastly, thank you to those of you who support the channel using the thanks button underneath videos. Your kindness is much appreciated. Paris's Historia Anglorum records that, nevertheless, at early dawn, although withdrawing with difficulty, he set out towards the castle of Laford, intending to lodge there, more inflamed with the heat of illness than of fires. But when he had with difficulty completed a journey of 30 or even 40 miles, sighing and groaning, overcome by the worsening disease, he ordered a bed to be prepared for himself in which he might lie more comfortably. But those who attended him, having no craftsmen, tools, or materials ready at hand for this, drew swords and knives from the surrounding willows and hastily prepared some sort of bed, fastening it together with coverings of a soldier's equipment and extending it awkwardly. When he had climbed onto it, and even when furnished with cushions and bedclothes and also straw, he was tossed about, shaken here and there, and almost broken, especially since he did not have horses suited for a litter. From this deadly pain, now worn out, he was compelled, as they say, to descend, saying, "These cursed, indeed accursed beds have already shattered and shaken all my bones. They have almost killed me." And it is believed that in that bed the distress of death troubled him incurably. Meanwhile, a most violent fever burned within him, which added fuel, for anger, according to the philosopher, is a heating of the blood around the heart, whence he scarcely reached the castle of Laford, being carried gently in a litter. Therefore, lying in the aforesaid castle, gravely ill, he received from the abbot of Croxton the counsel of confession and the Eucharist. Then he appointed Henry, his firstborn son, heir of his kingdom, and caused the realm of England to be sworn to him. He also sent letters under his seal to all the sheriffs of the kingdom and to the castellans, commanding that each should be attentive to him. And while speaking, one of those present said to him, "Our Lord Jesus, dying for us, prayed for his persecutors, leaving us an example. You likewise ought to remit all anger and rancour to all your debtors." To which he, sighing, replied, "This indeed is difficult for me, to remit all anger to those who strive to cast me down from my kingdom, leaving me with nothing, and to raise up my chief enemy while others still pursue me." For at that time certain of the barons were following him, wishing to submit themselves to him as their natural lord, and to make amends, and to experience his mercy, because of a revelation recently made to them, as has been said. Therefore the king fled from them, feared them, and avoided them, though he ought not to have done so, but he was entirely ignorant of this. And immediately one of his friends who had begun to speak added, lest the king's soul should be endangered, and said, "Lord, if it please you, it must be considered whether there was a reasonable cause why your anger rose against them. For if some cause urged and provoked them, one should act more mildly and deal leniently with them. But if not, even if they were manifest enemies, in such a case a glorious crown is laid up, for the love of Christ our Saviour, for those who teach and act thus, and for the salvation of your soul you should wholly remit any ill will towards your barons." But the king, now drawing his last breath, drawing a long groan from the depths of his chest with a sorrowful sigh, said, "If it cannot happen otherwise that I be saved, let it be as you have persuaded. And let this be said to my son Henry, that he likewise should do so, lest my soul be weighed down by his sin. And moreover, warned and instructed by my example, let him cherish, gather, and follow his natural men." These things having thus been done, the abbot of Croxton asked him, if it should happen that he died, where he would wish to choose his burial. To which the king replied, "I commend my body and my soul to God and to St. Wystan." Afterwards, on the night which followed the next day after the feast of St. Luke the Evangelist, he departed from this life. So John had a wretched end, which many felt he deserved. Matthew Paris said that perhaps some of the good works he had engaged in, like founding a monastery, might reduce his punishment in the afterlife. However, he followed that up with the famous comment that, "Foul as it is, hell itself is made fouler by the presence of John," so it doesn't seem likely that he really held out much hope for John's soul, does it? What about the king's earthly remains, though? Ralph of Coggeshall tells us that the body was embalmed, but that the process was not done with respect, saying that his household plundered all the things he had with him and fled from him in haste, leaving nothing with the body by which the corpse might be properly covered. But the castellan of that place, as far as he was able, provided for the body, though it had been eviscerated and left bare. He also tells us that Lord John of Savigny, who he cites as the source of his information, which is a useful detail, came to the house afterwards and stayed with the embalmed body, having a mass said for John's soul too. The corpse was later interred in Worcester Abbey, just as John had requested, and that request also appears in his will, by the way, so we know he made it. It wasn't just a detail made up by the chroniclers. Roger of Wendover tells us that the king was dressed in royal robes and carried to Worcester, and was there honourably buried in the cathedral church by the bishop of that place. He also says that some unknown person wrote the following epitaph for inclusion on the original tomb. Here in this sarcophagus is buried the image of a king, who, dying, brought much turmoil in the world to rest, and to whom while he lived disgraceful deeds clung. After death, let no evil fear pursue him in fate. You who read this, fearing as you behold yourself destined to die, learn what end of life may bring forth for you. Matthew Paris repeats these details in his Chronica Majora, but he also gives more details about the embalming process, saying that the abbot of the canons of Croxton, very skilled in medicine, who at that time was acting as the king's physician, after performing an anatomical treatment on the king's body so that it might be more fittingly carried, had the internal organs sprinkled with abundant salt, and had them transported to his own house, where he honourably caused them to be buried. In his Historia Anglorum he repeats this story, saying, physical dissection of his body having been performed by the said abbot, his entrails were buried, and his dispersed blood and flesh were carried to Croxton, and thus, by arrangement of the same abbot, there were buried. But the king's body, adorned with royal insignia, was carried to Worcester and reverently interred in the cathedral church by the bishop of that place. So according to Paris, not all of John made it to Worcester. His organs were buried elsewhere. The burial had taken place on or around the 23rd of October, and John was placed in front of the high altar, which is seen as a place of honour in a church. Originally, it would seem there was nothing but a stone slab to mark it. It takes time to build tombs after all, and William Marshall, Earl of Pembroke, is known to have provided silk cloth to cover it. The king lay between the shrines of St. Wulfstan and St. Oswald, which were not John's exact directions, but were certainly in the spirit of his wish to be buried in the abbey. In 1232, his body was moved into a new and swankier tomb. This seems to have been when he got a sarcophagus, in the presence of his son and daughter, Henry III and Princess Eleanor, and that should have been that for his burial. But it wasn't. Almost 3 centuries passed. The Plantagenets came and went, and the Tudors took the throne. Then, in 1529, in the reign of Henry VIII, John's tomb was opened. A description of the king's remains was written up by one John Beale, who said that King John was wearing royal robes and a crown, with a sword in the coffin with him, rings on his fingers, spurs, and even a staff and sceptre interred with him. The body then remained on show for 2 days before being reinterred. Remember that list of items that John had at that point, for it is evident from later sources, which we'll come to shortly, that the tomb was robbed during this time. Henry VIII's reign also saw the construction of a new stone base around the coffin and the removal of the relics of Wulfstan and Oswald in the late 1530s or early 1540s, thanks to the English Reformation, which meant that the cult of saints was no longer to be celebrated in the country's churches. These changes to the layout of these 3 men's burials would lead to much confusion in later centuries and ultimately to another disturbance of John's corpse. We now move forward another 268 years. The Tudors died out, and so too did the Stuarts. Then, in the reign of the Hanoverian king, George III, the tomb was opened once again in 1797. This was precipitated by the fact that no one was quite sure where King John was buried. The 1529 opening seems to have been forgotten about by this point, and the fact that the relics of the saints were now in one location in the church, but the tomb effigy for John was in another, thanks to the reorganisation during the Reformation, which I just mentioned, led to confusion about where he was. Was he in the Lady Chapel or the choir? There was only one way to find out. We have a great description of what happened next, published by a Mr. Valentine Green. He was a local historian who had recently published a book all about the history of the city of Worcester, but he wasn't actually present for the disinterment, and instead relied on the observations of his friends James Ross and Mr. Sandford, a local surgeon, who were there, and who sent him details of what was found, which he then used to write up a little pamphlet about the event. Ross also supplied an image of the corpse, which we'll get to soon. Green tells us that with the permission of Arthur Onslow, the then Dean of Worcester, the tomb in the choir was opened on Monday the 17th of July to see if it actually contained John's remains, on the understanding that if it didn't, it would be moved to the Lady Chapel, where he would then be supposed to lie. First of all, the stone effigy of John was lifted off the tomb. Then the stone slab on which it lay, and which was already broken in two, was taken up as well. Beneath it were two brick walls which had been supporting the weight of the slab and effigy, and in the gap between them was rubbish consisting of bricks and mortar. With all of this cleared, two elmwood boards were found, and beneath them lay the stone coffin itself, which the boards had formed the covering of. John had been rediscovered. Now, something I often get asked about old burials like this is whether bodies are actually in chest tombs or under them, below ground level. Usually I find that they are in vaults below ground level, but in John's case, Green's description and images of the grave show that his body or skeleton was and is on a level with the floor of the cathedral. If we look at Ross's picture of him, drawn in 1797, and at a modern photo of the tomb, we can see a low, grey, step-like structure on top of which the chest tomb and the effigy now sit, and in the 1797 drawing we see that it is within that shallow structure that the actual remains lie, inside a separate coffin. Green confirmed this by saying that the coffin, quote, is laid upon and not buried in or under the pavement of the choir. So John doesn't have a vault and is only a few centimetres away from the tourists when they pass by this tomb. I'll quote Valentine Green directly now so that you get the best description of the condition of the remains in 1797 possible. And as we only have one image of the corpse, I'll just leave it on screen so that you can look at the different parts of it as we get to Green's description of them. He says that the body was found, quote, to have been adjusted in the stone coffin precisely in the same form as the figure on the tomb. The skull, instead of being placed with the face in the usual situation, presented the foramen magnum, the opening through which the spinal marrow passes down the vertebra, turned upwards. I looked this up and he's basically saying that the bottom of the skull, where it connects to the spine, was facing upwards towards the sky. The lower part of the os frontis, that's the forehead and top of the eye sockets and nose, was so much perished as to have become nearly of an even surface with the bottoms of the sockets of the eyes. The whole of the upper jaw was displaced from the skull and found near the right elbow. It contained 4 teeth in very good preservation and free from caries. 2 of them were dentes molars and 2 bicuspids. The lower jaw was also separated from the skull. The coronoid processes were very perfect, as well as the condyles. There were no teeth in this jaw. Some grey hairs were discernible under the covering of the head. The ulna of the left arm, which had been folded on the body, was found detached from it and lying obliquely on the breast. The ulna of the right arm lay nearly in its proper place, but the radius of neither arm nor the bones of either hand were visible. Those of the ribs, pelvis, etc. were so much covered with dust and the foldings of the decayed robe as not to be clearly distinguishable. Part of the tibia of the right leg, in nearly its proper position, was exposed. The knee of this limb appeared to have been contracted, not lying so straight down as the left, occasioned probably by other bones or fragments having fallen under it. The bones of the toes were in good preservation, more particularly those of the right foot, on 2 or 3 of which the nails were still visible. The rest of the bones, more especially of the lower extremities, were nearly perfect, and on the whole appeared to have lain as they might naturally have done in their quiescent progress through the various stages of decay and dissolution. Some large pieces of mortar were found on and below the abdomen, and a vast quantity of the dry skin of maggots were dispersed over the body. These are supposed to have been produced by some part of it having gone into putrefaction, a circumstance imagined sometimes to have happened notwithstanding the precaution of embalming, previous to its removal, and the maggots having remained undisturbed were upon the present discovery seen in such great numbers, or that some parts of the dress, being of leather, they might have been produced by the natural putrefaction of that animal substance. The body measured 5 feet 6 inches and a half. Green also provided a description of the clothing John was wearing, or what was left of it at least. This appeared to be very similar to what his effigy was wearing, except with no gloves or crown. Instead, the real John wore a monk's cowl, meant to help him, quote, through the regions of purgatory. It fitted onto the head very tightly and was held in place with ties or buckles under the chin, fragments of which still remained. There was a long robe which covered the king from neck to almost his feet, and bits of its embroidery could still be seen at the right knee. It may have been crimson damask, but Green noted that it is but conjecturally it can be said to have been of any, meaning any colour, but what has now pervaded the whole object, namely a dusky brown. This corresponds with the original chroniclers' account of John being buried in royal robes, and by extension makes the rest of their information more trustworthy too. Green went on to note that the cuff of the left arm, which had been laid on the breast, remained. In that hand a sword in a leather scabbard had been placed as on the tomb, parts of which, much decayed, were found at intervals down the left side of the body and to the feet, as were also parts of the scabbard, but in a much more perfect state than those of the sword. The legs had on a sort of ornamented covering, which was tied round at the ankles and extended over the feet, where the toes were visible through its decayed parts. The firing about the left ankle still remained. The upper part of those coverings could not be traced, and it is undecided whether they should be termed boots, or whether they were a part of the underdress similar to the modern pantaloons. If you'd like to read Green's whole description, which includes things like the measurements of the coffin, which I didn't think we really needed here, I'll leave a link to his pamphlet below for you, which is freely available online. There are a few things to note from his account. First, John was in pretty good condition for a body that was at that time 581 years old. Nevertheless, there were clear signs that the Tudors had stolen things from the tomb back in 1529. The absence of so many of his teeth, with only 4 remaining, is a dead giveaway. Dead giveaway, see what I did there? I've done lots of videos about deceased royals getting dug up, and something I've noted time and time again is that souvenir hunters love stealing teeth, and by the time you get to the 2nd or 3rd opening of a tomb, there are often few left. This is unlikely to be due to decomposition in a well-sealed tomb, as teeth are very hardy and will last a very long time if left alone. Just think of the near-perfect mouthful that Richard III had when he was dug up in 2012, having not been touched by human hands since 1485, and he was just lying in the dirt. He didn't even have a coffin. See my videos on the digging up of Anne Boleyn, the so-called Princes in the Tower, and Charles I for just a few examples of this grave stealing. I'll leave them linked below for you. A comparison of what Bale said was in the coffin and what Green found also shows that grave robbers had been at work on the physical possessions left with the king too. Bale described a crown, sword, rings, spurs, a staff and a sceptre. These are metal objects and would have included a lot of gold, which is inert, meaning it doesn't rust and break down. Most, if not all, of these items should still have been there in 1797. After all, if the robes and cowl could survive that long, plus John's hair and toenails, even metal that wasn't gold surely could have. But Green mentions only the remains of the sword. Now, as I've said, he doesn't seem to have been aware of the 1529 opening, and therefore of the contents of the grave at that point. However, even he could tell from the state of the remains that they had been interfered with. He noted as evidence of this the damage to the coffin, which had a large crack in it, the fact that John's head was the wrong way round, with his jawbones badly displaced, and the lack of finger and radius bones. Unlike him, we can surmise that much of this damage was done to remove John's crown, teeth and rings, and even the fingers will have been taken as souvenirs. Again, this is something I've noted again and again in descriptions of grave openings like this, and I'll be offering you some further proof that that's what happened to John in just a moment. The grave robbing wasn't done yet though, and the Hanoverians were no more scrupulous than the Tudors. Green tells us that the body was left on display for only a day because of the multitude of people who came to view it and who quickly became ungovernable. Even in this single day, though, the body was so poorly guarded that more of it was stolen. We know this because of a curious little collection of objects held at Worcester Cathedral and in Worcester City Museum. The museum has 2 teeth and the cathedral a thumb bone. The provenance of the thumb bone is not terribly secure, though it was apparently given back to the cathedral 160 years after being taken, which would mean it was returned in 1957. But the teeth come with a little note which says, "These are 2 teeth taken from the head of King John by William Wood, a stationer's apprentice, in 1797. This extraordinary record shows that literally anyone in the vicinity could walk up to the open tomb on the 17th or 18th of July that year and pick bits out of it without being stopped, even a humble stationer's apprentice. These items were lent to the British Museum in 2015 for an exhibition about John and Magna Carta, and I found a press article which said that part of one of John's shoes was also on display at that time, having likewise been taken from the tomb. Basically, dear only knows how much of him is actually left in that coffin at this point. The Georgians picked over him like vultures, and the remains would have been better off just left alone in 1797, especially as the tomb was only opened out of nosiness, not necessity. Let's finish up with a brief discussion of John's spectacular tomb. From what I've learned from my research, this dates to about 1232, when he was first moved from his initial resting place. Valentine Green, though, surmised that it had probably been made by the same artists who created the tomb of Prince Arthur Tudor, who died in 1502 and who is also buried in Worcester. But the cathedral's own website and YouTube channel say that the effigy atop it is the oldest royal effigy in England, which is meant to show an accurate representation of the deceased. This suggests that it is indeed 13th century, not 16th, as this would mean it was created when John was still within living memory. And also because I can think of several other apparently accurate effigies which predate Arthur's tomb, such as the effigy of the Black Prince in Canterbury Cathedral, which dates to the 14th century. You might want to note, though, that John Gillingham, writing in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, says that while it was probably made in 1232, quote, "The effigy at Worcester cannot be treated as reliable evidence for John's features. In his opinion, that is too much of a time lag between the king's death and the creation of his supposed image, so it's really up to you if you think that we're looking at John's face when we look at his tomb." The effigy is wearing robes and a crown and is perhaps modelled after how the body was originally dressed, though unfortunately the nose and lips are broken away. I don't know when this happened, but an image of the effigy published in 1836 shows the nose at least undamaged at that point. The rest of the face, including chin-length hair and beard, remain intact though, and give a good idea of the man the carver wanted us to see. There are 2 little figures next to John's head, which I assume are meant to represent Wulfstan and Oswald, and his feet rest on a lion which is biting the sword he holds in his left hand. This may be meant to represent the loss of some of his power upon signing Magna Carta, when his people bit back against his tyranny. The rectangular chest portion of the tomb is decorated with red shields sporting 3 golden Plantagenet leopards each. There are 3 of these on each of the long sides and 1 each on the head and base of the tomb. The effigy would have originally had precious stones set into it and been painted in bright colours, but these are long since gone, and all that remains are the indents in the stone showing where the jewels once sat, and which are particularly noticeable around the cuffs and crown. I hope you enjoyed that discussion of the nasty death and desecration of King John. Let me know in the comments if you think his effigy is a reliable image of him, and for more videos about the deaths and afterlives of famous royals, see one of these videos next. Until next time all, keep learning.